Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you to the AAXX 100 Women and Architecture in Context, 1917 to 2017. Had to think about that one. It's so wonderful to see so many old friends, email friends, people who have come from afar. We have people from Kenya, from Australia, from Sweden, from North London. No, we have a wide range of kind of local, global talent here today, and we're just delighted that you've all come for this major event, which is the culmination of 4 years of sort of commemoration, exploration, research, writing, and this, we hope, will put a real critical edge on our considerations and research over the last 3 or 4 years. So thank you very much for coming. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. And it's my job to introduce my co-conveners. Elizabeth Darling, who's co-curator of AAXX 100. Elizabeth is based at Oxford Brookes. Sarah Turner, we're partnering with the Paul Mellon Centre, and Sarah has been a fantastic partner and friend throughout the process, so thank you, Sarah, for coming. And Manage Verghese, who we say, without Manage, this would not have happened, and I want to just recognize her here today. So we'll just ask all of the people I've just mentioned, the conveners, to say a couple of words.
Thank you, Lynn. Just want to add my welcome to Lynn's. It's really great to see you all here and to be part of this conversation which we're going to have over the next 2.5 days. I've just got a couple of thank yous, or one primary thank you, which is the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain kindly supported 10 student places for the conference as part of its remit to encourage and expand the discipline of architectural history. So I would welcome the students who have those places and encourage them to join the Society to expand its female membership and to encourage the Society to understand architecture as widely as possible. Can I also invite you, if you haven't already, to look around the exhibition while you're here and to add your comments to the visitors book. That would be fantastic. And the catalogue for the exhibition, or the accompanying book, I should say, is also available during the conference run at a very bargain price. That's my bit. I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
Thanks very much. My name's Sarah Turner. I'm the Deputy Director for Research at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, and we're based on the north side of Bedford Square at number 16, and I look forward to welcoming you there today for lunch and for our drinks reception in the evening, and tomorrow we'll be also hosting one of the panels. It's been an enormous privilege to collaborate with such an important project, and to really, AAXX has kicked off a collaboration between the AA and the PMC, and for that I'm enormously grateful. And I think actually working together and collaboration and friendship is going to be an important theme running out throughout these 3 days. And so we've put it into practice in Bedford Square, and I look forward to talking to many of you over the next few days and seeing those conversations grow. But just to add my thanks to Lynn, to Elizabeth, to Manage and the team here for being absolutely wonderful partners and providing us with such an intellectually stimulating project to work on together.
Short of echoing what everyone has said, it's just really exciting for me as an AA graduate and current employee of the AA. It's so exciting to be here and see everyone here to kick off the conference that we've been planning for so many years. And I guess my role here is to really start the whole event by introducing our two amazing speakers for the first talk. So the opening keynote to welcome everyone to the conference is by two very inspiring women in architecture, the AA Interim Director, Samantha Hardingham, and DRMM co-founder, Sadie Morgan. The title of this morning's conversation is Being First, which reflects the fact that they've often been pioneers in their achievements, breaking new ground for women in architecture, which is both exciting, but also makes us question why it has taken so long for women to be able to contribute and be recognized in such varied ways within architecture and its related disciplines. So to give you a short introduction to their impressive careers to date, this is a very brief summary, and in the slideshow and in the conversation, you'll hear more about it. Samantha Hardingham was an AA student and has subsequently taught across nearly every part of the school since 2008. She's chaired our undergraduate management committee, as well as being a member of our senior management team. And then she was appointed the interim director last academic year. She's an architectural writer, editor, and curator. Her most recent and celebrated work is the award-winning 2-volume anthology, which if you haven't seen, you definitely should in our bookshop. Cedric Price Works, 1952 to 2003, a forward-minded retrospective, published jointly by the AA and the CCA, which we launched in this very room around the same time last year. And it's especially momentous that she is interim director in this centenary year of women being admitted to study at the AA, as she is the first ever women director of the school. Sadie Morgan was just 26 when she set up her practice, DRMM, that as recently as Tuesday evening was awarded the 2017 Reba Sterling Prize for their redevelopment of Hastings Pier. She set up DRMM together with Alex de Rijke and Philip Marsh, and in 2013 was only the 4th female president of the AA Council, and she was the youngest president we've had, I think. In 2016, she was appointed professor at the University of Westminster and awarded an honorary doctorate from London South Bank University. She was also named New Londoner of the Year at the awards this year for her work championing the importance of design at the highest political level, including being one of the mayor's design advocates for the GLA. She's a keen athlete and frequently participates in everything from cycling to scaling mountains to raise money for charity. And in 2012, she was the only female aboard the winning GB sailing team for the Commodore's Cup. So please join me in welcoming Sadie and Samantha to kick off the AAXX 100 conference.
Can everyone hear? Just a phenomenal amount of work has gone into preparing this day, or these series of days. So I hope everybody really just thoroughly enjoys them. You are going to see I have no idea what you're going to see.
No, I have no idea either.
So there's
slightly worrying.
A slightly worrying assortment of slides that are going to go on. I think some are related to very much to Sadie, and I fear some might be related to me. So it'll be down to you to figure out which is which.
Well, we'll know when they're exciting ones, when everyone's
we'll know when you're all disappeared.
looking elsewhere.
But this has been billed as a... Hang on, I've got to get the sound right, because there's nothing worse if the sound is wrong. I've got pages of writing here, Sadie. You haven't got anything.
No,
so.
I do.
I just want to make sure you can hear. Yeah, see, there you go. There's a good one. This has been billed as a conversation, but I think it might be a little bit of an interview, really, but we'll see how it goes. And I have to say, there is a culture of this room. I first sat in this room 30 years ago as a first-year student, exactly 30 years ago, almost to the month. And I was brought up in this room where there was really much less of a threshold between this part and that part. It was highly interactive. And I have noticed in more recent years that it's increasingly less interactive, it's much less interactive. So I would encourage participation all round. And so I will be really, I've got lots to ask Sadie, and I don't know whether it'll be the other way around, but we'll go for that. But I really do encourage everyone to ask questions, chip in as and when. Please don't, it's not rude, it's audience participation. I think Manager has given a really pretty comprehensive overview of certainly your career, and certainly some of the highlights. They are vast, actually. And when Sadie and I had a conversation about what we might talk about, I think it was very apparent that actually the one thing we do have in common, we discovered, is that we both grew up in Kent. We are both good women of Kent, the Garden of England. So yes, this is a very international school, but we happen to come from a very small part of England, which I thought was quite interesting. And so I thought, and being in a mode where I just more or less finished not that long ago this work on Cedric Price, which is wholly chronological. I'm sort of in a chronological mode. And I think there's something quite useful about that, particularly in that one of the things that I know you've said, Sadie, in your various comments I found that you've written, that you advocate the importance of design that connects people back to place.
Yes.
And so I wanted to start by asking you about connecting you back to the place where you started and where you began and where you grew up, and how formative childhood is to you now, do you think?
Yeah, it's funny. I think, I sense there may be some formative childhood snaps up there. I was brought up in a commune in, of all places, Sevenoaks, which is a sort of anathema because I think it's my communist grandfather picking the most Tory, stronghold in the whole of the UK. But I spent a long time thinking it didn't have much to do with the way in which I've, I guess, formed and formulated my career and thinking, but actually it's totally fundamental. And the interesting thing about being brought up in a place where your parents don't have to be responsible for everything is that you learn very quickly that you need a group of people around you with different perspectives. And if you can learn from those different perspectives, then you come out, feeling much better about yourself because you can generally pick the person who's going to teach you the things that you want to hear. And also have a very clear sense of the importance of looking after each other. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I was, it was set up by 3 professional families, and so they decided that they would put all their money into one large house, and they would all live and eat together. So the rule was one room per person, and my grandfather was a psychiatrist, and he had a lot of gay and single mothers who he would look after, and throughout his career we would have his patients come and live within the community. So he actually did start care in the community. And he also believed very strongly that women should be able to go out to work. So he had a nursery, and I went to that nursery, and my mother went out to work. And as I grew up, I was surrounded by a nuclear physicist who lived above me, so I would always go and chat. If I had a problem with my homework, I'd pop up there. If I needed to have a fag and talk about sex, I would go to the barmaid who lived in the flat, across the way. And if I, so it's probably best to stop there. But I also had a huge sense of responsibility because from the age of 5 or 6, I would come home and look after my great-grandmother, who, by the time she died, was 111, oldest woman in Great Britain. And not thanks to my care, I have to say, because I really just went out there for the Marmite sandwiches. But I still feed the very elderly lady who lives across the way every Sunday night, and my children have grown up understanding. My 2 young, my 2 young girls, they're not that young anymore, 18 and 20, are the most extraordinarily independent young women who have they judge nobody, they are completely capable of having a conversation with an old person or a young person, and it's a very special way of growing up, I think.
So you continued to live in that way? I mean, in the commune with your own family?
Yes,
growing
I
up as well,
still,
so you
still live there.
live
Never,
there.
never left
Never
home, as many
left.
people keep pointing out to me.
That's incredible.
At the age of 48, slightly sad. But anyway, so I still live there.
No, well, that's a good advert, I would say, for it. Yeah,
I think it's a really interesting. I mean, it's a really interesting social model as we move to in a place where we, we are going to have a much more elderly population. We have a much more diverse set of communities who are becoming very fractured. And how do we, as a society, encourage generosity? And how do we encourage a sort of sense of community that if we're not careful, we lose? And if you look at what's happening around the world, it's quite frightening.
I mean, that would take me very neatly into asking about many of the housing projects that you've worked on, but I might hold back for a moment. We might come back to that, because I'm now kind of intrigued how did you then went and studied architecture?
I studied interiors at Kingston.
Interiors.
Yeah, and then I went to the RCA and did architecture interiors there.
Right.
Yeah.
And how because the decision to do that, was that something you knew you wanted to do, or was it a sort of thing, I can do it?
Funny, I sort of fell into it, and I seem to fall into most things, and that might just be a subconscious, actually I definitely want to do that, I'm just going to find a different way of doing it. But I studied art and physics and biology, and because I hadn't studied chemistry, because even though I went to a very good grammar school, there was no ambition other than to be a legal secretary as opposed to a secretary. So I actually didn't have the combination of grades to go and be a doctor, or so I was a bit stuck. No one really knew what to do with me. I'd go for my careers advice, and they'd like,
yes, I remember that thing. I don't know whether it is about something about anybody that ends up in a school of architecture. I know a number of careers I was offered in I think pig farmer was one of them. It seemed that
I didn't get that
the
one.
subject combination fitted that. I don't know how art history led to pig farming, but it is interesting how these things.
But I think those things that I take heart, and I think actually nowadays it's very different. Nowadays our young women are given really different types of advice, and they're encouraged to, go for professions that we just, no one even considered that would be on offer to me.
So at that point, was it a case of finding something that you enjoyed doing, or was there somebody that was sort of inspiring you to think, actually, I'm really interested in design? And
well, my father was an architect and came to the AA.
That would be a clue.
And my mother a designer. So I think that I've always been in a family that believed that design mattered. So in a sense, there's always huge pressure to go towards an academic career, and somehow if you do anything related to art, it's in some way not it's not the potential isn't always seen. So I never felt any pressure at all about what it was that I would do, or that actually I wouldn't make a success of what I did.
Yes,
I think I was.
Well, I think, that in itself, the idea that you build, and again, I think we'll come back to it, but this idea that you sort of have a plan, when you're talking about how young, particularly young women, I think I think it's equal, young men and women. There's a pressure to absolutely know what you want to do and how you're going to get there and what you need in order to get there. And we were talking about this the other day, but I don't think... there's certainly a way of working where you have no idea where you're
did you have a plan?
I had no plan. I can tell you I had no plan.
So we both lived in Kent and neither of us had a plan.
We had no plan. And I think, so then to talk about plan, at some point you set up in practice. Yes. And you need a plan, you need a business plan, maybe.
Well, the funny, the irony about that is, again, so Alex was my tutor, Philip and I went to college together, and we were invited to submit some work for the Architecture Foundation's 10 new architecture practices, and we sort of, because we'd all slightly collaborated doing different things, we submitted a sort of a group of work, and we said Alex DeRiker, Sadie Morgan and Philip Marsh, and then we got picked as one of the 10 with HMM, Crusoe St John, anyway, you know, the Birds Portsmouth, I always call him Birds Portsmouth Ruffian because I adore him, but Russell, very, you know, sort of, you know, some well-known names. And on the back of that, there was a competition to design a building for the LLDC as it was then, and we won it. And, you know, none of us had got qualified, and we were like, oh, what, you know, we were just kind of mates who, you know, and suddenly we had to formulate a practice, and we didn't have anybody, as I say, who was actually qualified at the time.
So
So we went home, and I said, Dad, can I use your professional indemnity? And which is not a normal request from a daughter.
And of course he said no.
Yeah, of course he said no. So he said yes, and then because he would always do anything for me. But very tragically that summer when we were designing it, died very unexpectedly of a heart attack. And so we were, you know, forced, if you like, into a very different plan. And I think my life's been a little bit like that ever since. And we put ourselves together as a practice. Alex was a tutor here, and we supported him in that. We basically ran our studio from downstairs.
Which room? You can name
I can't remember. And we'd have meetings up in the bar, and you know, the AA is absolutely wonderful for being able to do things like that. You know, we'd say, oh well, if you know, perhaps you'd quite like us. We, in our spare time and evenings, we'd just come and use the, you know, studio space to run our practice.
To run the office.
And then when people started to notice, we thought we'd better become a bit more legitimate and get ourselves a place. So it was an extraordinary time, and one that was just full of kind of exploration and interest, and absolutely no money. But that's very freeing if you don't earn. I mean, I've never worked for anybody, which it's quite good. So I remember getting our first £1,000, and it was literally like after about 9 months of working, like £300 each. And,
things are looking up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, well, that is, in terms of firsts, this is about firsts of everything, really. But then so that was your first competition,
and
which you built, or you didn't?
No, it didn't get built. I mean, you know,
built.
like most competitions,
they don't.
Yeah.
So then you keep doing competitions, and then your first building is with Roger Zog, as we call him, but Roger Zagolovich, developer, which is also an interesting collaboration in itself.
Yes,
and would you call it a collaboration? Roger Zagolovich is a developer who was also former president of the AA.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, at times it felt kind of a little bit other. I mean, the thing about Roger is he's an incredible patron of young people, and sometimes you thought, oh, that's because he can manipulate you and get you to do what he wants. But he's actually the most extraordinarily lovely person to work with, and we learnt a lot from each other. And I think any architect who becomes a developer, it's very difficult to stand back and not get involved. And sometimes that's complex and difficult, you know, because it's difficult to let go and let your chosen architects, you know, do work together. But actually in this instance, it was good. And we'd never build in concrete. We'd never do half the things we did in that project. And it was great for your first, you know, client relationship, to be working with somebody who understood understood architecture.
Yeah.
So it was fantastic. I adore Roger. Yeah.
No, it doesn't. Well, it's a form of practice that he's really pursued, isn't it?
Yeah.
To try to work with an architect and
he's genuinely passionate, about what he does, and that's rare.
Yeah, unnecessary, I would think. So, in terms of the that then informing a kind of, I suppose, set of design themes and tropes and values within the practice, did that come out of? I suppose the question is, how did you, once the practice sort of really was, once you got your £1,000, you thought we're on the way, how did the projects choose you, or did you choose the projects, or is it a bit of both, do you think?
I think it's a bit of both. I think we had a fascination with materials. We had a fascination with using off the shelf. We had an exhibition and book that the AA published a long time ago. In the gallery
across there.
And so that was all about using resources carefully and inventively. So we tended to be given very difficult, complex problems with very small budgets, and which is a wonderful place to start, because all you can do is be inventive and clever and problem solve. And then after a while, you look at all these people who've got these incredible projects with big budgets, and you sort of you gaze into the distance and think, oh, wouldn't that be nice? But you soon realise that actually what matters to you is delivering projects that, we did a lot of social housing, a lot of schools, and they don't tend to have big budgets, and that's fine. And you take your pleasure and your pride from designing great spaces, better classrooms, good public realm, more interesting community type buildings, all the things that actually matter, I think, to creating a better society. And if you can if you have any chance whatsoever to do something better, or more thoughtfully, or more robustly, then that's, I think, as a practice, we naturally fell into that way of working, because we all very strongly believe in that, in society.
I was going to ask, was it a kind of collective belief, or is it, are there parts of that work that sort of fall into, between the three partners, that sort of fall into specialisms, as it were, or is it very much a kind of collective?
I think when we started, Alex used to say he was the head, of course.
Yes.
I was the heart, and Philip was the hands. And
were you happy with that idea?
I didn't really think about it. I sort of I thought about it. I'll move on to that in a minute. But so when we first started, we all did have different skills, and I think that. And slightly different interests. Alex is absolutely obsessed with materials, wood in particular, and Philip is very clear. His skill set is, planning and sort of putting things together, and I obviously, can do all of it.
Yes. Obviously, we haven't got halfway there.
I tend to draw people together and ideas together. I think more importantly is, and so will naturally be the glue that holds these things. Holds, I think, not just as it was then, Philip and Alex together, but also the wider practice. But when it comes to head, I think that probably isn't a good analogy, because we all obviously have huge input into the sort of intellectual capital of what we do. So it took me a while to work that one out.
Yes,
but I got there.
You got there.
Yeah.
Well, it takes a while, and doing projects to make that, to understand that arrangement between individuals, I think is. So that would very naturally lead you to being all the other things that Manager didn't really list, actually, which are all the things you do currently.
Yes.
Chair of the Independent Design Panel for High Speed 2, quite big project.
Yeah.
Member of the National Infrastructure Commission, UK, pretty big project. Member of the Thames Estuary 2050 Growth Commission.
That's right.
Mayor's Design Advocate for Greater London Authority.
Yeah.
And there are more, but I'm
Professor at Westminster.
Professor at Westminster University. Professor at Westminster. That's so to go from the scale of the house,
Yeah.
or the scale of the homework, to the house, to then national infrastructure, it's all the same, or
Well,
is it? The scale is different.
It's a funny. I'll tell you the story. I'll tell you the HS2 story because it's quite interesting for today. So when I concluded my presidency of the Architectural Association, my true belief is that it's really important to do stuff outside of your practice, especially if you've never had a job with anyone else. You can get a little bit introspective. So and I loved that. I loved having a different kind of conversation, and I felt that it would be good to do something similar. And a friend phoned up and said, "Oh, do you know they're..." And I'd been involved in putting together the brief for High Speed 2, for the design vision for High Speed 2. And a friend said, "Oh, do you know they're looking for a chair?" And I said, "Oh, no, I didn't." And so I phoned up and said, "Could you send me the job description? Or no, could you tell me where which paper I go to?" And they said, "We'll get back to you." So I said, "Okay." And then nothing happened, for a day or two. And then I got a call saying, "Yes, we will send you the job description." And so I got the job description, and so it wasn't a pay, it was and I looked at the job description, I felt physically sick. And I thought, oh, there's no way, it was like, you must be, this and that, and you have to have done that. And I read it and I just thought, oh, how embarrassing, what am I going to say now? And my absolutely lovely office manager at the time read it and said, "Oh, Sadie, do that standing on your head. Of course you can, you'll be fine talking to the BBC, you'll be fine talking to the politicians, you'll be, of course you can do it." Well, of course, maybe you need a bit of help with that. And I sort of read through it and I thought, actually, once you break it down, and I thought, actually, I probably could do that. And so I rewrote my CV sort of accordingly. And handed it back in, and then I didn't hear anything, and then they said, "Yes, the headhunter wants to." And I was thinking, headhunter, and obviously never having a job, I didn't, and this unbelievably awful man phoned me up and said, the first thing he said to me, not hello, "You do realise what a high-profile job this is?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And you do realise that you will be expected to talk to politicians at the highest level. And by then that was like, you tell me what to do. And so the relationship went on from there, not very well, until he interviewed me and then decided that maybe I could be deputy.
Oh, nice.
And I was given an interview. The other two were sirs who were on the shortlist, and I was given an interview, and I had absolutely nothing to lose. And they said, "What do you think of the design, our design vision?" And I said, "What design vision? I've never seen any. Have you looked at your website? Have you looked how awful that, And they were, by the end of it, I think they just thought, just shut this woman up. I think they understood that they needed to be told something different, and they needed to be given a different perspective to the one that they'd been having. And they appointed me, and it was I was thinking, oh God, now what do I do now? But it's been the most incredible journey, and I absolutely love it. And I feel that it's really important, actually, to do.
Well, it's that's interesting, that idea that that there is nothing to lose. You're right. Well, part of the idea that kind of a job description would be something that would put you off, rather than kind of make anyone think, oh, actually, I could have a go at that, and then get to the it shows a sort of fantastic. It's partly determination, but also it's the idea that you try and put me off. That just makes me want it even more.
Yeah.
So it's advice to anyone interviewing out there, I suppose. It's maybe it's not. It's a counterintuitive tactic also, but
I think it's it's so interesting once that switch is turned, and once you actually begin to truly understand your value. And I didn't understand my value until I was invited to sit on the National Infrastructure Commission, and I arrived to my first meeting, and I had Lord Heseltine sitting next to me, I had Lord Adonis sitting opposite me, I had Demis Hassabis, who I frankly think is the next Einstein, who is the genius who put together the put together the software that beat Go, which has more computations than there are stars in the sky. I had Satin Besley, who's the chief economist to the World Bank. I mean, and I just sat there thinking, I think I don't feel great about this. I'm slightly nervous, And then the Chancellor of the Exchequer walked in, and I just think, I'm going to throw up. I've never ever felt like I needed to put my hand up and say I need to go to the toilet or something. I mean, it's just like get me out of this room. And then I was given, and then he said, well, I'm going to go around the table and I'd like you to tell me what you think of the National Infrastructure, Commission. And they'd given me the papers like the night before, and I kind of, hadn't really had much of a chance to read them. And everybody around the table started, with really sort of, clever answers. And I was thinking it's fine, because we had to give a speech. They'd asked me to give a speech to launch it, and that was into sort of 5 minutes. And I was thinking it's fine. By the time they get round to me, it'll be gone, and it'd be too late. So, and then he said, Lord Heseltine, who's sitting there, oh my God, it's going to be me next. Anyway, it was absolutely fine. And then every time I went to a commissioners' meeting, I would think, what is it that I can offer? And I suddenly understood after about the second or third one that what I can offer is there's a lot of big strategic thinking that happens, yet there is so very few people who have the capability to bring that thinking and touch it down to people in place, and who can talk about things that in a way that consider what it means to normal people, and what it might mean to our environment, and that it isn't just about GVA, and it's not just about getting the kind of numbers right, that if you're going to invest in something, then you have to think about the wider benefits, and that's not always cash.
Yes, and not always on the table. I wonder, in terms of now this definition of architecture and women in architecture, that one thing is I was wondering whether at any point in that it's entirely it's a debate, and it's a discussion, and it's about speaking and presenting and being able to present your ideas extremely clearly, and know, as you were saying, very clearly know what your role is in that, and being able to articulate it. And if you were ever tempted to, or maybe you did, to draw, did drawing ever come into that means of understand, or did you go home and try to draw it out to understand it, or is it all?
No.
It's a different
I think
design pursuit. It's all, if one thinks about it.
It's exactly the same design pursuit in that you are solving problems, and it's a very three-dimensional activity. But I have the capability, I think, to do that in my head. And that's a skill that I've learned over time, because you you have to learn to make decisions, big, strategic, important decisions very quickly. And I think as architects, I was taught a very different way of working, which is have a problem, unpick it, work it out, take a look at it, sort of, and then come back to it. And I nearly always came back to the same, the first thing I drew. But you had a long time to think about whether that was the right solution. And actually, when the irony is when you're making much bigger, complex decisions, you tend to have much shorter time. You have all the information condensed in front of you, which is very different. So you have to analyse it very quickly and come up with a decision. And that is there's a lot of pressure around that, but it's also hugely exciting, and it really involves a different type of the same type of thinking, funnily enough, just at a very different form.
Yeah. Is there anybody that you, going back to the inspiration question again, now out of what inspires you when you're young to start doing what you do, is there anybody now who sort of you think you focus on picking actually, because it's been making very big difficult decisions, strategic decisions is an alarming thing to do at certain points. And do you have a reference point that sort of reminds you, okay, if I stick to that, then it'll...
I don't...
Or it's just built with your own...
I admire so many people, and they tend to not necessarily be those who I would suggest to my peer. I have huge respect for a lot of my peers and the work that they do, and I respect all the people who work in my office. I respect my sister who's a nurse. I respect my mother, who I respect a whole group of people for different things, and I tend not to, I was asked that question, who's your inspiration? I said Michelle Obama, because anybody who can be such a public profile standing next to the most powerful man in the world is a woman that but that sounded a bit glib, and I thought, actually, who do I? It's a really complex one, and I don't always have an answer. Actually, I tend to take inspiration from those around me.
Well, it's also the business that you're in, which is about the people that are around you.
Yeah.
Also, which would make good.
Yeah, but it's like being here, isn't it? It's like having to run like you do an organisation like this. The thing that at the moment I really think a lot about is that you have to create something that's stronger than the sum of its parts, and because there are so little resources around, and you find that in all the work that I do with the National Infrastructure Commission, the Estuary Commission, the HS2. It's like, how do you create a group of people or a group of ideas or whatever it might be that somehow, because they're combined together, are much better because of it.
It's okay. I'm going to move on to there's a very neat link here which you don't personify in any shape or form. I do have a hero, and I spent quite a long time writing a book about him, but Cedric is my hero.
Yeah, no,
and you don't look like Cedric at all, but you behave quite like him. You don't smoke. I don't mean not smoking cigars, but there are two really interesting parallels. Just part one being,
I'm totally flattered.
It's their big shoes to fill, literally. He was a great champion of women. In the respect of women, he was the one man, I think at the time, it was in the early 80s, who was allowed to go to the National Women's Conference. They let him in, which was, I always thought was impressive, because he was always interested in championing the people around him and how they could be in the world and how it could be better for everybody to be in the world. So he clearly identified that. He also did a lot of work on the infrastructure for the Channel Tunnel link going from Stratford. So a lot of that strategic thinking in and around connections and those moments of arrival and departure,
which are absolutely
which are just fascinating and crucial. So did a lot of work, which of course is invisible really to the profession. It is a lot of, although he drew quite a lot of it, which is takes me back to that question, but it's invisible work in a sense, but also has a 25-year lifespan in terms of just the thinking before it even has any physical impact. So that sort of scale of working, and then the pier, the fantastic pier, which is the prize-winning pier, which I think Alex described as a bit of a Cedric project.
Yeah, definitely.
Because there's
there's
not much architecture, or it's not much building, which is different to not much architecture, which I just, one of my favourite quotes on one of Cedric's drawings that he wrote for one of his members of staff one night, having left the drawings on the table, and Cedric had sort of marked them up, and he'd written on it, "Too much architecture." And it was absolutely that. He just got carried away with form and aesthetic and not thought about, no, what's the idea and what is it actually for? So I just wonder how much of that thinking is, it clearly resonates because you're nodding, and there's a kind of sense of those ways of thinking at the AA, but what that means in terms of how a form of your practice, because I mean I would say that there are no single project is like the next one.
No.
And
I think that's something
similar.
we're very well, we don't plan it that way. That's just the way it happens. And I think that if you look at Hastings Pier, which I have to say is an extraordinary project, because less is more in this in this instance, and it is about listening to it's an architect as curator rather than sort of builder, and the way in which that project came about was all about collaboration and all about restraint from our side, actually, because they wanted a iconic building at the end of the pier, and I tell you, as a young architect, well, we're not that young, but as an architecture practice, that's all you want to do is like iconic building, and then you realise that that's absolutely the wrong solution, and the right solution, as Alex has been quoted as saying a lot, was to do nothing and to make a service platform on which anything could happen, and which opportunity was which offered huge opportunity to the local residents and the community. And I think that if you take that thinking and say something that I believe very, very strongly, increasingly, is that design isn't, I keep saying this, design isn't just about aesthetics, it's about problem solving. And we have to understand better as students and as architects what our skill sets are, because I think that in 5 and 10 and 15 years' time, the way that we work and operate will be completely different to that it is now. And we are very slow in picking that up. And I work, as I said, so, I have a lot to do with Demis, who is the creating algorithms which are capable of doing things that, is too frightening to even think about. Now, luckily, he is not Blofeld. Luckily, he is the most generous, incredible human being who wants to do good with his huge resource and brain. But, we're in a place where algorithms are now designing structure. So all the motorway signage is put on structures that are designed not by people but by algorithms. And I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily something that you can say will happen to our buildings, but we have to be seen as relevant to a conversation that begins much earlier on. So I think that things are changing so quickly, and I see it, when we talk about infrastructure, that we have to, as a profession, get wise and get in early, and convince politicians and convince big organisations that architects and designers and creative thinkers have a place at the table, and that without the perspective and without the ability to think, we have an imagination, and I tell you, there's not many people, in the powers that be that have that capability often. So we have this huge skill. We can look into the future, we can imagine, we can, I can't say we can predict, but we have an opportunity to actually create our future. And in doing so, we can think of the problems and the opportunities in a way that most people aren't capable of doing. So if you talk to us when you're writing your brief, rather than when you've written your brief and you need an answer, then you tend to write a brief that has the capability of producing an architectural solution or a three-dimensional solution that has already thought of all the things that may or may not go wrong, but more importantly, what may or may not go right. So, my big push at the moment is to convince politicians, to convince the national infrastructure, which I think I've done, to say you need creative people. So there's a recommendation in the interim report that we put together a group of designers and thinkers who will help and support all national infrastructure commissions. And when it's £200 billion of our money that will be spent over the next 20 years, and if we're not careful, none of us will be involved in that, because it's a different type of built environment than we are designing at the moment. So design strategy is a new course that we need to think about.
School of natural thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it is. Well, it's keep up the good work. That's all I can say. I'm going to bring this. You sort of answered my last question, really, which was there's this brilliant quote, which I'm now not going to be able to find. No, I am going to find it, from Winifred Ryle. It's my favourite one, who was one of the first four women who we are really celebrating. One of the, and I'm not sure this.
I don't know which one.
Can't tell from the hairstyles.
Oh,
Yes.
Ruth, okay. We must get out. Anyway, whoever's got Winifred on. She said that in 100 years ago, that in the near future, the woman architect will be not only a vague possibility, but an absolute necessity.
Yeah.
And I would say that every team needs good women, and then the other way of saying that is, if every team needs a good woman, actually, no, I'm not even going to answer that question. It's an assertion. Every team needs a good woman. And I think you're proof of that. And now I'm going to suggest, I have got other questions, but I think we should open this out to our audience and take questions. Any questions? Probably about a lot of the pictures that everyone's wondering what on earth they're looking at. But
about that building, actually.
Oh, Kingsdale.
Relating, maybe I don't need it. Oh, sorry. I've got quite a loud voice. My question is, relating to the subject that Samantha was just talking about, form and aesthetic, or what is the idea and what is it for, that theatre that you designed inside Kingsdale, I'd love to know what the thinking was behind it, in terms of form and aesthetic, and what's the idea, and what is it actually for?
Kingsdale, you need to sort of step back to be able to answer that question. So,
I've been there several times.
Yeah.
It is an iconic building. It's absolutely amazing. And you walk into that space and it just blows your mind. So, and I've been inside it. And so I'm just very interested in the
auditorium you're
in
talking
how it came about, how you...
It came about because we were trying to find a different way in which the children would operate, how the soft structure of the school would operate. So they would have, and I can't for the life of me, the name of it's completely lost me, but you have, instead of classes, so you have your year groups, but you also have cross-cutting groups that take in, yeah, yeah. No, it's some. There's anyway. I'll think of it. It's a very school-specific word, but it's about having groups that are made up of much older and younger children, and they, in order to facilitate that, we thought we needed a space in which they could meet, and so the auditorium was initially conceived as being that space, that was that special space that would draw together those groups of those specific groups, and then of course it became, because you have to make that kind of space work much harder than than just doing one thing. It became kind of the heart of the school, and a place. Yes, yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, sorry, that's really unhelpful, isn't it? But it's trying to break down a structure and transform it in order to come up with a better community, actually. So it was disruptive, and that was the sort of architectural disruption in the middle.
I think it worked.
Yeah, I think people got married in there. I mean, they rented it out. They'd had at least 3 or 4 people getting married in there, and it's open to the local community, and so it has become the heart of the school, and so in that sense, but.
And the school has gone from strength to strength.
Yeah, best improved school, I think, 2 years after it opened, and that's a lot to do with the concept, the hard work and energy of the Architecture Foundation, and my very great friend Lucy Musgrave, who had the sort of creative idea about about how you can design improve school results, and that how you measure good design is something that we still haven't grappled with, and I have to say is something that we have to manage much better, and is actually a part of the National Infrastructure Assessment, which says we have to find different ways of measuring outcomes for big infrastructure projects, and we can't do it, as I said before, around a business case that does not think about quality of life. And so all of these, that's one of the first projects, all of those themes run through, I think, how we have to think about our future, and how we put together strategies, policies, and briefs that enable that to happen. Because unless we write a brief, or unless government puts down metrics that allow quality of life to come through, then we don't have a fighting chance of convincing them that good architecture, good design matters.
With your infrastructure hat, there doesn't seem to be any great idea for Britain in the future. It's all piecemeal. Crossrail is brilliant, but they're not developing on that. They're tinkering about with Heathrow, which isn't a hub airport. If you try to get from one airport building to another, there's no transport other than a bus or taxi. It's not a hub airport. And they're just not thinking big enough. I was always in favour of what became Boris's scheme of having it in the estuary. And I think we've had so many projects such as the Olympic project, which is an enormous development in northeast London, and then the Isle of Dogs, all the port infrastructure has been built up. And it seems to me, and you as a Kent girl would know this, that we should be moving east so that we don't overfly the City of London, which I think is an absolute abomination, and no other big European country, important European country, would dream of doing that with their aircraft. Are you involved in this great idea that how we should really be moving things east, where all the recent development has been?
Well, I think actually what I'd like to do is answer a different question, because when it comes to a kind of big strategic vision for the country, one that is visual, I think you're quite right. And I think as a profession, we need to reflect on why that is. And I think we have to be much more proactive about helping government to do this, because they don't inherently have the skills. So if we are critical about how things are put together, then, you know, one of the things that the National Infrastructure Commission is trying to do is to help prioritise and is to try to help put down, you know, in a report an assessment of what we have and what our needs as a country over the next 20, 30, 40 years. What it doesn't do is put that down in a visual map, for instance. There is no, I have another bee in my bonnet, which I probably shouldn't go on about, but that's about the fact that there is no visual map. In you know, only Sadiq has only just come and is putting an interactive map. There is no map that talks about the development that's about to happen, or the infrastructure that's there as existing, the new infrastructure. There is no
Joined up thinking.
Yes, but who's good at joined up thinking? Who's good at putting maps together? Who's good at planning? We are. And what are we doing about it? Nothing.
Yeah. Then we're not invited to do it.
It does. Who needs an invitation? You know, we should be gate crashing. You know, we absolutely should be.
I was going to say, I mean, it's very much a part of a definition of a way. I mean, it stems from possibly the evolution of maybe the architect and the role of the architect now.
Right.
I think it's been probably evolving in this way for a very long time. But that idea as architect as not waiting to be asked, but as provocateur and activist, and putting the projects on the table before waiting for, you know, as I said, not waiting to be asked. And that,
but
that
you
culture
see, you'd know better than anybody, you know, how that unfolds. And if you look back over history, you know, you're quite right. But I don't know what's happened. I don't feel like recently we've been, maybe somebody can help me out.
Foster has done it, hasn't he?
But I think that we have to move away from the kind of master plan that is about a grand vision that nobody can afford, because it doesn't engender, you know, trust in an outcome that everybody can buy into. I mean, I think we have to be visionary in a way, in a different way now, because things are very different.
But they talk about having a new town. And that could be a new town.
I think we have to set down a sort of a light touch strategy type frame under which local, you know, we can have a much more sort of bottom up.
The pier is a good metaphor.
Exactly,
I think the pier is the metaphor.
Thank you for helping me out here.
No, I know absolutely but it's a sort of providing an empty space with a few really useful bits to hang on to. And I think that's, as a metaphor, and which is why it's so, I believe, very profound that the Sterling panel has given that project a prize, is because it recognises that as a form of a plan, and not as a gratification exercise that we all do things beautifully, don't we? And I think that's a major shift for architecture, for the better, I hope. But I think it goes along these lines of how do you, and of course it is a difficult conversation to have in terms of visual,
Yes.
the visual, because
Yeah.
things that are very flat tend not to be
Yeah.
visual in a very particular way, as opposed to things that are very 3-4 dimensional. And so that I think in itself is an interesting provocation.
Also, what's interesting is how you explain and communicate.
Mm-hmm.
So when I sat on the National Infrastructure Commission and we do these independent reports, they're always written reports. And we're doing a big piece of work around Oxford Milton Keynes Cambridge corridor and understanding why and how we need to help that area really develop and sort of create the opportunities. And I said, well, if we are talking about infrastructure and that's our remit, then how do we make sure that infrastructure unlocks housing, which is the thing that's stifling Oxford Milton Keynes Cambridge? And it's all very well, so we write a report about it. And I said, but how do we explain that when you are putting infrastructure in, that you need to create proper communities and that you can't just deliver housing? We have to deliver housing that are homes, and we have to deliver homes that are formed communities. How do we do that? What does it look like? And everyone's really frightened of putting down what it looks like. And I convinced him to run an architectural competition and with multidisciplinary teams, including economists and various other people who would come forward and help create a vision about what good looks like, what success in terms of building communities in relation to infrastructure looks like. We need more of
examples.
Yeah.
Can I make a historical connection? That's my job. Is when I was listening to you, I was sort of thinking, well, who does this remind me of? People could go and look at in our exhibition. You have predecessors at the AA of women who've done 50 years ago just what you're doing now, being people who are major players in influencing national infrastructure and the kind of environment that people grew up in after the war. So you have people like Mary Crowley, great school architect, collaborating, working with users, all that kind of thing. And you have the great unspoken Judith Lederbauer, probably the most important, least known architect from the 30s, 50s, who plays an absolutely crucial role in developing post-war housing and envisioning what that is. There's this great tradition of women at the AA who identify major social problems, say, here are some solutions, and then actually get themselves into roles where that can happen. So it's great to see that kind of resurging, and they've got that model from the past. So I just wanted to make that connection.
Thank you. No, there's no better way of helping to predict the future than looking back. And because it's nearly always been done before, just
the variables are just different.
It's just you just have to sort of overlay it onto a new kind of set of. They're often the same problems. They're just manifest in a different way.
It'd be nice to get those politicians to come and look at exhibitions like this to see that it can work.
I spend a lot of time cajoling people to. Yeah, actually going and looking at what good looks like makes a massive difference. We took the senior team at HS2 around Holland to look at what good train stations look like, and actually how you can regenerate huge areas, with that small piece of investment if you have joined up. Thinking, and if you look outside of the red line, which is, tends to be a bit of an issue.
I actually have a small question for Sam, to maybe explain some of the slides up at the top and to reflect on a kind of a different career within architecture that's been everything from writing books and interviewing people to try and get some projects down on paper, to teaching a brilliantly diverse selection of student projects, there's lots of pictures of sandwiches, and so I thought it'd be nice to have you explain that a bit to the audience.
Yeah, I'd worried you'd ask me that question, but I think the sandwiches are probably the useful point. I think the one drawing that my tutor here, Sand Helzel, who I have to say I totally go with everybody being part of one's inspiration, but Sand was particularly extraordinary. She now is in Australia, but she was my tutor in second and third year, and the one drawing she kept of mine was a drawing which I could glamorously say was a section through a British Rail sandwich, but it didn't really look like a section at all. But anyway, it was my best drawing. It was a rubbish drawing, but she loved it and she's kept it. And she did tell me last year she still has it on her wall, which is just appalling to me as a thought. But
I would have thought that's wonderful.
Well, I can't imagine what. Anyway, the sandwich, I suppose, reoccurred, and the one thing I did when I left here, or one of the things I did when I left here and didn't set foot in the building for about 15 years, because that seems to be what has to happen, is I set up what was initially one coffee bar, and then it became 3. And I thought I was just doing architecture. I was just being an architect. But at that particular moment in time, it was sort of not particularly healthy time in the construction industry. Yeah. So the kinds of jobs around weren't particularly attractive. And I think I probably wasn't sure I wanted to be an architect anyway, but I loved architecture and what to do anyway. So the obvious thing, go and make up a coffee bar. But actually what it was about was very small scale kind of urban regeneration. Because with no money, you discover the only buildings you can have. I think there are some slides up there of really derelict properties, which happen to now be in very underelict Islington and Clerkenwell. But it was that period of time where estate agents were just desperate for people to occupy their buildings and hold on to them until the developers redeveloped those areas. So we had incredibly cheap rents. And we had our wits about us. So we made a business, which then, I think there are bits and pieces up there that we would then tap into our architectural friends, and Will Alsop came one evening and he presented the project he was going to be doing for something the next week. And Paul Finch's office, who was the editor of AJ at the time, his office was around the corner, so he came in for breakfast every day. So there was always a kind of it became a sort of place where we would discuss these things, but actually just ran a business. I made cups of coffee and made sandwiches, because actually that's what it's about. Everybody's coming in for food, and it had to be good, and it had to be open at 6:30 every morning, because that's where everyone went to work, and till God knows when at night. So it was a really extraordinary, it was the sort of project I suppose I'd made at here, which was about what happens if you just open your front door. People come in, and it becomes the place. You've made the place. And actually it was just the one, this is how I remember when it was just pre-laptops. And we had one PowerPoint at the back of the shop, and we discovered that really our clientele were freelancers that lived nearby, and actually it was a place they could suddenly go. This was pre-Starbucks, pre all of these things. There was suddenly a place to go, and there was a socket, and they had a laptop, and they could charge their laptop on my electricity. And it was at that point that, I didn't put that in the business plan. But then it was that moment you realise, and then you start talking to planners, and they say, we've got another street down the road, Exmouth Market, which is just, nobody will go there. Will you go? And yeah, of course we'll go. And foolhardy. And then Exmouth Market. Anyone who knows that bit of London is another story. But it was an incredibly exciting time just to go and open literally your front door, and people would come, and then people would come every day. And I remember, and she's probably not in the room, but I can tell it because she's not in the room, but Liza Fior at the time had just had a baby. And I knew Liza, but had never spoken to each other. I'd seen her around the building when I was here as a student, and she walked in the door with her baby, and then she came in every day with the baby, and the baby would sit on the floor and take cake and rub it into the floor happily. And Liza would sit there and just read the newspaper to cover and totally ignore the baby, because the baby was happy with cake in the floor. And every day she would leave and I would try and get this cake out of the floor. And I never told her. And then I said, I think about 20 years later, I said, you know what you made me do? She said, yes, but you saved my life.
Yeah.
Because I had somewhere to go. So that's what the sandwiches are about.
But what an extraordinary, that's lateral thinking at its best, isn't it? In a funny kind of way. And I think that you solve a problem by opening up another opportunity.
Yeah.
And
yes, it isn't linear
no,
in that sense. It isn't a problem as presented and you solve it. You respond, I suppose, in a way that.
Yeah. And then that's when it gets exciting, because that's when things pop out that you least expected. And you become, it takes you on a different journey than you thought.
Absolutely.
This is probably a question for both of you. So you talked about coffee shops, you talked about showing people good design. I just wanted to know, kind of actually experiencing something different often changes people's minds or challenges them to think in a different way. What other tactics do you both use to challenge people's perspectives, I guess, in your roles at the moment being firsts? But also just of kind of in design generally and how that can help the world or change people's minds about what architects do and things like that, I guess. What tactics do you use?
Ooh, tactics, that's a good one. I suppose one tactic is to ask really obvious questions, and often saying, this is a really stupid question, but why are you doing that? Or it tends to be the sorts of things that one's talking about are habitual. Whether it's a first-year student who already within a month is kind of habitually starting to do something in a way because they think this is what architecture is about, or this is what I think it was supposed to be about. So asking, and that I think that does apply to all the way through to a diploma student who's been doing this for 5-6 years now and really knows what they're doing. And then you think, well, none of us really know what we're doing, so you have to keep reminding yourself, why am I doing this? And what am I doing it for? So I suppose, though, that if that's a tactic, it's asking a really obvious question, I suppose.
It's a great answer, and I'll give you a good couple of examples of, I couldn't agree more, and I think that if you are disarming and you are honest, then people respect you for it. So, and that takes confidence. It takes confidence to ask a question about something you don't understand when you think everyone else understands it. And I remember sitting in the National Infrastructure Commission and the economists were just having a conversation between themselves, and I absolutely lost me. And I do know what it means, but I said, what does GVA mean? And Tim Besley said, thank God we've got Sadie. And I think it's exactly right. You have to keep asking the question, and in order to remind people why they are sitting around having the conversation. And it's a little bit like if you have a game plan or a vision or whatever it might be, you tend to do it and then put it in the drawer and carry on. And you have to keep going back to that belief, that ethos. We at Durham, we write our ethos, what matters to us, up on the wall, And I always keep, you have to remind yourself what matters, and whatever that is, because it will help you develop in a way that is has much more integrity, I think. But just, my tactic is always to not be threatening, and that's the best thing you can do surrounded by politicians.
It's a good tactic.
Yeah.
Even if you feel a little bit inside.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask you about the politics of the boys' club, because if you look at the architects, the women architects who came from the AA, they've been architects like Rosemary Sternstedt, lead designer of Central Hill Estate and Alton East Estate. Patricia Tinsdale, who became, I think, the head of the housing department back in the 60s and 70s. And I understand the importance of getting to that table and then hearing the discussions that are happening around it. And then it's also about the experience of that, right? Of just seeing, of actually not being afraid to fail, just seeing things through. But how, because it is quite difficult to break into that. I know that recently with all the scandals that have come out, there's been a sense of protecting that, who actually sits at that table. So just wanted to, find out how, because you've now, you have managed to get onto that table, but just having you there isn't enough. Do you know what I mean? It's just, and it's not just like women, there's like ethnic minorities and LGBT voices. And that's something which needs to be...
No, I mean, we absolutely have to work harder to have a better, diverse group of decision makers. I completely agree with you. How one does that quickly and in a way that is embedded is something that I think people struggle with. When it comes to women in the profession, I just, my office has always had more women than men, not because of any particular sort of emphasis on wanting that to happen, but because we employ the best people. And increasingly, if we can open the doors to young people and show them that it's a career path that is manageable, whatever your background, then that's where we have to start. And I think that the process takes time to filter through, and we are absolutely, I'm very, very positive about the ability for diversity to come forward much quicker. And I think when these types of scandals happen, or when corks unpop, as everyone talks about, then we have to grab those opportunities and make sure that we show in a positive way the absolute difference that having a good mix of people around the table makes. And I would just say that I have never felt in any way patronised or lesser because of anybody else's reaction to me around the table, at the NIC in particular. And Lord Heseltine, I was brought up by a very socialist background, and my hate figure was Margaret Thatcher when I was younger, because that was my politics. And then I go and meet Lord Heseltine, and he, I have to say, is if you ask me an inspirational figure, he is one. He's the most extraordinarily clever, intelligent, positive man who would make sure in every occasion that I was part of the conversation. I used to travel around with him for the Thames Estuary Commission, and it was like going with royalty. He'd get off the bus and everyone would crowd round him, and I'd just be left, on the bus. He would turn round and ask them to move out the way and invite me down, and then we'd sit round a table. Only Lord Heseltine, he'd say, I think Sadie could answer that question much better than me. And any photograph that was taken, and they'd try and kind of, he wouldn't have a photograph taken unless I was in it as well. There's a sort of, I think that you can be, you can imagine things happen, and the worst of people, and then you meet them and you realise that actually, or you put yourself in that situation, and actually it isn't like that. And maybe I've been lucky in the places, in the positions that I've been in. But I have to say, I've only ever felt valued, hugely valued.
I mean, I would just respond to that point, that I think it sort of goes back a bit to the, what are the tactics, and also a bit about what we were talking about earlier in terms of young people and the sort of plan and the emphasis on needing to know what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and that's entirely predicated on the courses you choose and the grades you get, and of course all of those things are very important, but the other part being that in order to build it, all of those things are dependent on a confidence. And I have to say there's a thing called a personal statement that every student has to do when they leave school, and they sort of have to live and breathe that actually. But the level of confidence at that point is not great. It's just part of the teenage brain. It's not particularly, together at that point. But that moment between, the room that we're in terms of higher education, that point from where you leave school and then really develop as a young adult, and gain some of that confidence to know that I can ask a question, and if it's seemingly a stupid question, it's always an intelligent question. And that is the thing I think that cuts through any of the questions about diversity and gender, and that would be the bit I would say absolutely needs to be encouraged much more. To bring that level of confidence through, so that one can be utterly at ease with whatever the politics, whatever the situation actually, to know that you're asking relevant questions, relevant as well as stupid.
I think unfortunately, I'm sure that there's more questions in the room, but we have to cut things short now because it's, I guess, time for lunch. But I just wanted to thank the two of you for being so generous and sharing so much of your personal experiences with us. And I think it was also a really inspiring note to end on in terms of what can we do to instrument change going forward for everyone. So thank you very much. Lunch is in the Paul Mellon Centre, which is in number 16 Bedford Square. Okay, look for the blue flag. That was what directs you, and then we'll start the afternoon session at 2.